So medieval manuscripts are very different than contemporary books. They went through an entirely different process than we go through now, and it was much, much more time-consuming, extremely expensive. Books now are cheap, they're very disposable, not so a medieval manuscript. So you saw in the previous video how things changed for the Anglo-Saxons when the Christians converted them, and this included changing how they wrote. Originally, or before the Christians converted them, the Germanic folks, the Anglo-Saxons, the Old English folks, used a runic alphabet. They wrote on materials. They didn't have paper. They didn't use ink. They carved into things. They carved into wood. They carved into clay, stone, weaponry, statues, all sorts of things. It wasn't until they were converted that they started using parchment and the Latin alphabet. So parchment was used as early as the 6th century BCE in places that were not England. It was used in Egyptian, Islamic, Assyrian, Babylonian, Roman, Jewish cultures. All of them had parchment. The Anglo-Saxons did not. The Germanic people did not. That wasn't their thing. Instead, the Anglo-Saxons, like I said, they carved runes. So you can see the runes carved into this Anglo-Saxon dagger or seax. There's no circles in runes because you had to carve them. And it's hard to carve a circle. So they're all angular. Here's an example of runic writing. The Anglo-Saxon rune alphabet is called the Futhorc alphabet because the beginning of the alphabet, just like ours, is the ABCs. Well, theirs starts with the letters F-U-T-H-O-R-C, Futhorc. This slide shows the Anglo-Saxon runic alphabet, and the Anglo-Saxon runes are different than other runes. If you've seen Celtic runes or other kinds of runes, they're going to be different than the Anglo-Saxon runes. I mentioned earlier that writing and literacy and poetry was seen as something really powerful, to the extent that it was almost seen as magic. Written words were almost seen as possessing magical power. So today even, runes are often still associated with magical power. In particular, a number of poems that exist had their origins in runic writing rather than in Latin writing, and eventually they became Latin writing. So there's a poem called Dream of the Rood, which is in the Norton, and you can see it on pages 32 through 36, which it does have an Old English Latinate in the Latin alphabet iteration, but it first appeared on this cross that you see here in this picture, the Ruthwell cross. The manuscript that it appears in is from the late 10th century, so like 990s. That's a similar time as Beowulf, as Judith, as the elegies that you're going to be reading. They all came from right around that same time. But the Ruthwell cross is a stone sculpture that still resides in England, but now it's inside. It used to be outside. That dates from the early half of the 8th century, so 700, 750. And remember I mentioned that the Old English itself begins to be its own language around that time, 700, 750. So these runic writings on this cross are some of the earliest poems that we have from the Old English language. And in fact, the top box of this runic inscription is a quote from the runes of Dream of the Rood on this cross. So if you'd like to take some time to translate maybe the first 4 words, go ahead and pause and take a minute and translate them and see what you come up with. So hopefully you went ahead and you translated the first 4 words. So the first word, yes, you got it. That's right, it's Christ. Christ is the Old English version, but Christ is the contemporary English version. So was is was, was. The next one, on. Yes, it's on. It's the same word. Christ was on. Okay, Christ was on the rodi is the word in Anglo-Saxon, which means rood, which is an Old English or Anglo-Saxon word for tree. And tree, metaphorically then in this poem, means the cross. Christ was on the tree because the cross is wooden and the wood comes from the tree. This gives you a sense of the fun, the interest, the desire that Old English poets had for wordplay and ambiguity. I guess you could call it punning, but it's more like metaphoric. It's not so much a pun as a metaphor. Christ was on the tree because he was on the cross. So it's a small metaphor, which was very much part of Anglo-Saxon literary tradition. They loved ambiguity, metaphoric constructions, figurative language. One section of the dream, in fact, is so figurative that folks think that it may have been a riddle. And we saw some riddles the other day. If you want to follow along, this is on page 33 of the Norton Anthology, starting right around line 28. That was years ago. I yet remember that I was cut down at the edge of the forest, torn up from my trunk. Their powerful enemies took me. So you hear that the root is speaking in the first person. The tree is saying, I did this, I did that. And the tree's using ambiguous or metaphoric language. On the next page, he says things like, I was reared a rood, I was raised a tree. I raised up a mighty king, the heaven's lord. I dared not bow in homage. They drove dark nails into me. The dints of those wounds can still be seen. All of this leads up to line 56, Christ was on the cross, which is the exact line that we just translated together. So because it's from the first person, because it describes the experiences without naming them at first, some people think that the original version of this may have been part of the riddling tradition. It certainly has that descriptive ambiguity, that metaphoric language to try to describe the things happening and achieve the most powerful emotional effect. Both The Dream of the Rood and Caedmon's Hymn take part in dream vision literature. Dream vision literature is something that uses the device of the dreamer narrating a dream in order to develop some spiritual or religious vision of truth. Dream vision literature, we see it with religious poetry in the Anglo-Saxon period. We see it in examples from Europe like Dante's Inferno. It continues in English literature with poems like Piers Plowman, with parts of Spenser's Faerie Queene, with some of the work of the Romantic poets in the 19th century, and even in literature today like Alice in Wonderland and other fantasy literature, Wizard of Oz, it was all a dream. So the point is that when you're in the dream state, you are able to access information, truth, spiritual advice that you can't access in the normal state. Sometimes the dream state is a literal dream where you're sleeping. Sometimes it's induced by some divine catalyst. Sometimes it's drugs. It depends on what century you're in, which text you're reading. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about manuscripts. So, a medieval manuscript is essentially the equivalent of a contemporary book. Oftentimes they functioned as anthologies or collections of a bunch of different texts all put together. It was a lot of work to make parchment. So you can take a look here and see that first you had to kill a giant animal of some kind. The bigger the animal, the better. Deer was commonly used. Deer parchment is specifically called vellum, but different animals were used, whatever animal you happen to have the skin of. Then you had to scrape and stretch and dry the hide and treat it with various concoctions in order to bleach out the color and get rid of the hair, and you had to stretch it to be very thin so it could be written on. Then you cut that big sheet together into smaller pieces. I've got a picture of here, right? You cut that big sheet that you saw in the previous picture into little pieces, just like you did in kindergarten when you were making a book that you would staple. Those are called folios. And here's an example of what that looks like on this page. Then you stitch all of the folios together, and that produces a manuscript. And then you cover that manuscript with leather or wood, and that's what turns it into a book. But you didn't always cover them. Sometimes you just took a folio around and carried that with you places, because an entire book's worth of parchment was extraordinarily expensive and a sign of great wealth. But maybe someone would have 4 or 5 pages that had been stitched together. They would carry a folio around. So there actually is quite a bit of literature during the Anglo-Saxon period or Old English period, but most of it is in Latin at that time, since that was the language of Christian learning and the language that most people were writing in. Anglo-Saxon poetry, however, Old English, is found only in 4 manuscripts. Mostly. There's some here and there, but the bulk of it, most of it, is contained in these 4 manuscripts. And that's it. That's all we have. That's the extent of the poetry in the Anglo-Saxon period. So you can see the names of these 4 manuscripts here, and I'm going to talk to you about each one of them briefly. Here's just another example of what medieval books look like. This one's a little bit later on, but still you get the idea. Here's our first example of one of the medieval manuscripts. This is the Cotton Vitellius A15, which is also called the Knoll Codex. So like pretty much all the Anglo-Saxon literature that we have extant, it's from the late 10th century. You can see on the edge and at the bottom of this particular page, which is the very first page of Beowulf, that it was damaged by fire. You can also see at the very top that the first line was more decorative and then it got smaller as you moved on. And you can see still the influence of the runes on the writing, even to the side. The very first letter there is an H, and then the next letter is something called a win, and the next letter is called an ash, and the next letter is a T. I'll explain a little bit more about those letters when you get to the Old English pronunciation lesson. So the very first word there is what, and then the next word is another win, which makes a W sound. It looks like a P. So it looks like PE, but really it's WE, which is we or way. What way? And then there's a G and an A and an R. Those look pretty recognizable as contemporary letters, and then a D. And then you can see the E has been slightly burnt off. What way garde is what the first line says. That's one of the manuscripts. Judith, which you've read or you will be reading, is also in that same manuscript. The Exeter book is a really important one, and luckily it never burned, and you can see how beautiful it is because you can see the page there. It's also from the same time period as everything else. It happens to be the single largest collection of Old English poetry that we have in existence. The riddles that we looked at are from there. The elegies that you'll be reading are from there, as well as a bunch of other things. So it is a giant anthology of beautiful Old English poetry, the Exeter book. This is the Vercelli book. It's not in England, or at least it wasn't when it was originally found. It was in Italy. No one knows how it got there, but it's where we see Dream of the Rood. That's the poem that I talked about earlier in the lesson, as well as some other mostly religious poetry. So people think that it was probably brought there on a religious pilgrimage since it's full of religious poetry and traded or something along those lines. All right, the last of the 4 manuscripts is the Junius manuscript, and it's also known as the Cadman manuscript since it contains poetry from Cadman. It is also mostly religious poetry. It's from right around the same time period, and it's the only one that has illustrations. As time wore on, medieval manuscripts just got more and more and more complicated and beautiful, and great care and art was involved in their creation. One of the things that people did with them is called illumination, which is where you see the little gold highlights or the red or actually the ink itself is highlighted. The letters are highlighted, and so it looks illuminated. It looks like there's light shining on it with the gold. This is why people would steal them, because they were full of all this very expensive stuff and beautiful illuminations and lettering and something called miniatures. So a miniature was a miniature. It was small. It was a little picture. So you see these little pictures here. To the left is a picture of Chaucer in a manuscript that actually you can go see in the Huntington Library. It's the Ellesmere Chaucer, and it's available in the Huntington Library in LA. And then to the right, you can see another example of a miniature that's been destroyed a little bit. One of the things that's interesting about medieval manuscripts is that oftentimes the illuminators couldn't read, or most of the time they couldn't read. So depending on the quality of the communication between the writers and the illustrators, sometimes the illustrations would have something to do with the text and sometimes they would not. But what typically would happen is one person was the writer. They may or may not be able to read, but they would write the actual words down, and they would leave spaces for miniatures to be added. Then someone else would do the illuminations, and someone else would add the miniatures. So it was sort of like everybody had their own specialty. It wasn't one person doing all of that. Kind of akin to how contemporary comics work. You have people who write the stories, people who draw, people who ink, people who letter. It's kind of a similar thing. So these last 3 pictures are just some examples of how elaborate manuscripts got. To the very left, you see an example of a technique called interlacing. Interlacing is one of the things that the Celtic population contributed to Old English culture. It happens in literary contexts as well as artistic contexts. In the middle, that is a text on math. It's a geometry text, so you can see some illustrations there meant to illustrate geometric figures. And on the very right is an example of a piece of music. Most of the people in the Anglo-Saxon world would have consumed their literature by going to a big hall and hearing a poet recite the poems or the literature or the text. And they would recite it, oftentimes usually with music, and in a very performative way. So most people didn't read anything. The manuscripts were really the purview of the elite and the clergy only. All right, that's it for this little talk. Thank you very much for your time.